All right. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Um, just a little background while we're on the title slide. I started working on some of the tools you'll see at the end or products I worked on with Jennifer Veloff, formerly of Pasco Hernando State College and Colorado School of Mines. So I like to give her a little credit when I do these presentations. This is not a new regulation, but around 2020, it was revamped to provide some clarity, and it is much clearer. I understand as instructional designers, technologists, sometimes we get a few faculty on these webinars. You probably already spend more time on compliance than you might like to. So one of our goals today is to show you how this regulation makes sense instructionally. It fits the spirit of higher education. There's choices that preserve academic freedom, in my opinion. It lends itself to intentional design practices, and most faculty are probably already doing it. You're probably going to be primarily helping faculty document the good work they're already doing. So next one, Brian. So I'm going to take a step back. Originally at my institution, we did primarily promote this as a compliance issue. So let's look at the next slide. And we were in one of our faculty colloquial meetings, and one of our faculty, I'm not even sure who it was in the meeting, in the crowd, made the statement, "We are the academy," speaking of the faculty. So that got me thinking about this image of the academy and what was going on here, this rich interaction that would have existed in the very earliest days of higher education. Let's look at the next one. And then you've all seen a slide like this in a presentation at a conference or webinar where the presenter talks about how this one-to-many model of education did not change for decades and decades, or maybe even centuries. But as we go to the next slide, one thing I want to point out is it did provide the opportunity, at least, for two-way interaction. It didn't always take place, but it provided that opportunity. Next, Ryan. And with the advent of reliable postal service and then other forms of mass communication, a new model came along in the educational space that did not have that opportunity for two-way interaction. Next. And I'm just going to pause here and remind you, I'm going to move through a lot of these pretty quickly, but you will get slides. There's a lot of information on them. So this is just a graphic. I believe the citation may be cut off at the bottom, but just showing some of the information we're going to go into. But the Department of Ed came up with this idea of RSI as part of the distinction between fundable and non-fundable courses for the purposes of Title IV financial aid. The distinction between a true distance learning course and a course fund. Hit the next one for me. So real quickly, there are some key elements here. Most all of us would check off the appropriate form of media box there. Basically, if you're not mailing materials back and forth or just providing some sort of one-way closed circuit TV or something, you're probably using an appropriate form of media. Then that idea of regular and substantive shows up. It is useful to note that the accrediting agencies are given some latitude all throughout this so that as time goes by, interpretation of these regulations was meant to be through those peer accreditors. There's the idea of two forms, and it's useful to point out this is not two instances, it's two forms of substantive interaction that's occurring regularly, that's scheduled and predictable. There's a monitoring requirement we'll talk about, and there's a requirement for responsiveness. And I've got all the places you can find all of this in the regulations. If you like to sit down on a Friday night in front of the fireplace with a glass of wine in the Code of Federal Regulations, you can do that and read up on these. All right, next, Brian. Okay, so this idea of monitoring student progress. When these regulations came out in 2020, a lot of people immediately thought big data, and they thought, oh, am I going to have to go get one of these solutions that plugs into the LMS and just crunches all the data and gives me engagement graphs and all of these different things, because those solutions are certainly out there and there may be a place for them, but they're not required by this regulation. All of these bulleted points down the rest of the slide, they come directly from that page in the CFR. And, for the most part, I think they're things faculty are already, or at least should be doing. Third from the bottom, considering the quality of students' work. I mean, that's kind of part of the regular duties of a faculty member in the course. So they built lots of stuff in here to meet that monitoring requirement that is part of what we do. Next. So I try and reaffirm faculty that reassure faculty that one of my takeaways is that the Department of Ed has reaffirmed their role. And the credentialed human faculty member is how we're going to continue to deliver instruction to students. And that seems really obvious to us, but if you're listening to policymakers, commentators, outside of the education space, that's becoming less and less obvious to some people. And if we look at the next slide, I think I made this slide up about a year ago with tools that came to mind then. So there'll be far more here, but these are different sources of great information that anyone can access. And well, whether it's great or not, maybe up to debate, but lots of information. Some of these tools are being used by credentialed faculty to streamline their workflows or provide maybe more robust materials than they would be able to create. So this is introducing a little bit of gray area, I believe, for those who aren't really knowledgeable about what we do as a profession. So let's go to the next one. And I think what this has done is it's made the department look at distance learning. I think this may be one of the reasons why this regulation was clarified in 2020, and say, okay, there's a real possibility here of distance learning becoming a high-tech correspondence, where things are set up in an automated fashion, and maybe the faculty member isn't as engaged as they believe they should be in order for that interaction to be taking place. Next. So I believe this piece here further reaffirms the role of the faculty member. Part of the 2020 regulations specifically excluded AI and auto-grade functions from contributing to compliance and RSI. So this was, before ChatGPT, all of that. But there were definitely tools out there that faculty were using. Nothing in this regulation prohibits faculty from using tools that are useful to them, whether it be AI or something else, hand-recorded videos, whatever. There's nothing that prevents them from using tools that might not count towards those instances of right-on interactions. It's just that it doesn't count for that you need to find other ways to document compliance. All right, thanks. And that, I keep talking about documenting that accountability piece. For the faculty member, there are those quantifiable and qualifiable, two instances, and then different types of interactions. For the institution, they need to have a defensible process. I'm going to let that word defensible out of the whole presentation, but it needs to be a defensible process for ensuring faculty are engaging in those interactions. And we've handled that through worksheets that faculty members complete. And I saw Nancy on the participant list, Nancy Kiefer at our institution, and she helped shepherd that process here. So that link will be on the last slide. Next, Brian. So this is, I always like when I'm speaking to designers, just to kind of run through this. I think you all know why you're so valuable at your institution, but you're in an interesting spot between the faculty role and probably many of you as well. And most of you work for somewhere in the academic administration, you report to somebody in that area. So you're helping faculty do what benefits students, but you're also helping administrators comply with different rules and regulations, and that makes their life. Next one. Oh, well, this is you, Brian. So I'll pull up and watch the chat while you do these slides.
Thanks, Josh. You made the point that we're kind of like we help faculty comply. I like to say that we're the executive branch, but that also kind of makes us the president. So I don't know if that's the best analogy, but we do help with compliance. That's an important part of what we do. Another important part of what we do is to help with the design and delivery of courses, right? And I think they're very different things, how we structure the course versus what actually happens when delivering the course. And this is where RSI actually measures the delivery of the course. So in other words, are the instructors actually executing on the plan? Are they communicating with the students and that kind of thing? But the design is still very important. So for example, if you use quality metrics, those are going to focus on the development of the course. And if you use Quality Matters, SRS 5.3 says that we plan for email and paper feedback. So like how fast am I going to turn around emails and how fast am I going to turn around papers? And that's an important part because that's setting the stage for the interactions in the course. So kind of making a plan and all that is very helpful. Another part I think that to pause right now is, and I saw this as a question that was asked a lot in the pre-webinar questions, was kind of like how to communicate this to faculty. And I think that this is definitely a place where we can get into TMI for faculty and really sharing too much information and overwhelming them. So the way that I like to view it is during the design process of the course, We have a tool bag which has so many tools that the faculty are never going to see or interact with, way more information than they know. But as an instructional designer, to have the tool bag and have all the tools is going to equip you to then develop a good course that when they deliver it will be easy for the faculty, convenient for the faculty to meet and exceed the RSI standards. So I think that the key is to develop a really good course and then reinforce with the faculty during that design process of like, these are the things that then you're going to need to do so that you can meet this standard. So here we go. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? I think is whenever there's like new legislation, that's the first thing, and this isn't that new, but that's the thing that everybody wants to know is this a good thing or a bad thing? I'm going to make the case here, and Josh touched on it earlier, that this is a good thing. This reaffirms the faculty. And I think that this is like a quote unquote get to, not a got to. With my first point here, which is that this differentiates really good online courses from other courses that might not be as high quality. It creates a lot of value for the students. It goes back to what Josh was saying about how faculty saying we are the academy, and we're affirming that and saying, yes, that faculty, what you do is very important, and the feedback that you give the students and how you teach the students is very important. I'm going to use an analogy that kind of swings the pendulum the other way to remote learning. And during COVID, and there were a lot of people who did a great job with remote learning, but there were a lot of people who maybe weren't as prepared with that. And there were quality gaps there. So what we're doing again with RSI is we're affirming the quality that we create for our online courses. The second point talks about generative learning, which is the idea that we all have a schema of all the things that we know. And generative learning is like hooks onto that schema. So you take a new piece of information and you're going to hook it onto like something that's related to that. And that's what RSI does, is it gives the students a chance to ask questions, to be more than just passive learners, to interact with the faculty and really help drive good hooks, and for the faculty to reinforce those hooks and make sure that that there's really good deep learning that's happening during the course, driving conversations around the content. The third one is a hot topic in higher education right now, which is this idea of belonging, and we're creating interactions, and we're saying, you know, online learner, you're not just off by yourself in some, you know, who knows where doing who knows what, but you belong here at this university, and you're important, and we care about you, and we see you, and we want you to learn. And I think this is what RSI does, is it brings those interactions to the forefront. And then the final thing that it does is it does proactive quality control. I've kind of skirted around the bush a little bit that we're driving better outcomes, having proactive quality control. In the context of all the laws that have ever existed, I think this is a really helpful law for students. And I think that it helps on a lot of levels. It's also the minimum it also sets a minimum, but it doesn't set a maximum. Like, there's no cap to it, right? So just like with, you know, ADA, you know, you can meet the minimum of ADA, but it's actually better if you can exceed kind of the minimum for ADA. And that's kind of what's happening here is it's going to set a minimum for us, but if you want to drive interactions in a course beyond that, then you absolutely can do that. All right, so let's talk about actually applying RSI and what are the things that we need to do in the classes. And just to recap, the R is for regular, means plan, schedule, that kind of thing. The S is for substantive, which means content related, not course administration related, right? So if it's a geology course, we're talking about geology. We're not talking about that the paper's due in 2 weeks or whatever. And then interaction basically means faculty and student interacting back and forth with each other, not just one-way video or something like that. Also remember that you need 2 things, not just one thing. So hybrid and synchronous courses don't automatically technically qualify. In practicality, they would. It'd be hard to imagine that you'd have like a hybrid course and be meeting with the students and not stumble across one of these other things. But you know, that technically is the way that it works. So I'm going to give you a bunch of possible ideas here and things. I organize them into my confidence level. They'll continue for 3 reasons. The first one is that we need to plan for the future. So if you're going to be developing a course today, in a year from now, in 2 years from now, you're going to want to use that course 5, 6, 7 years from now, hopefully. Hopefully it's not going to expire in a year or two, and you're only going to get like 1 or 2 uses out of it. So by me putting my confidence level in it, I think that's something to do. The other one is that many of the questions will be answered on a case-to-case basis. And you don't want to be the one that's that case that relied heavily on a kind of borderline scenario. And then now all of a sudden, you're called to justify why you lean so heavily on this one thing, right? It's this idea of Andy Stanley has this guardrails idea that we're not going to drive right next to the edge. We're going to drive a little bit off of the edge and put a guardrail up. And I think that that's another reason why. The third thing, the most important thing, is I thought it would make for a more enjoyable webinar. So you may disagree on some of these things. That's well within your prerogative, but I thought this would make it more interesting. So here we go. These are the things that don't feel like you need to be vigorously writing all these down or taking screenshots. Tom is going to share this PowerPoint later. So this is all coming your way. The things that I have very high confidence in long-term RSI inclusion start with synchronous lectures with video discussion and weekly video lectures with synchronous discussion. So I think that if we were flies on the wall whenever they were writing this, all these standards and everything like that, that I think that this would be the heart of what they were going for. They wanted students to be able to have synchronous discussions with the faculty, and they understand that that's not appropriate probably in every single course. That's not, you know, the number one thing. So they gave us a little bit more leeway to do the most appropriate thing in the courses. But I imagine that they were saying, like, how can we drive more synchronous discussion? How can we build more value into it that way? And, you know, it doesn't just have to be the same cookie cutter, discussion every time. It doesn't have to be formulaic. So I'm not going to get into all the active learning strategies that you could possibly use. I don't know that this is the place for that, but by all means, in a synchronous meeting of some type, you could play games and mix in teamwork and problem-based learning and all different kinds of like AVID strategies and all these different things. You can mix and be as creative as you want, but the idea is that the students are communicating with the faculty in synchronous time. The third thing I put down there, I have high confidence it lasting a long time, is weekly conference phone calls like it's 1990. And the reason why I'm putting that in there is because RSI isn't the only criterion that we should use. So our weekly video or weekly phone calls appropriate in some courses? Yeah, maybe. But that's an instructional design decision between the faculty and the instructional designer. And it might not be appropriate in all of the courses. So, but again, you're having discussion with the faculty and the student, and they get that connection. The third one is regularly scheduled help sessions. Could be like a Q&A kind of a thing, could be just a review, but it's faculty helping students. And we're going to talk about office hours in a little bit, but I want to just point out that in this regularly scheduled help sessions scenario, it's the faculty being proactive and scheduled, reaching out to the students and saying, hey, these are the times when you can come meet with me. We're going to be reviewing the content. These are strategic, and I made a decision to have help sessions, and you can come interact with me in these times. The last one is conducting content-based survey. So in other words, like maybe every 2 weeks, I'm going to just say, you know, hey, send out a survey. Hey, how's it going? And then here's the key, is I'm going to take that feedback and I'm going to make some changes. I'm going to interact with that feedback some way in the course. So I'm going to say, like, maybe it's content related, and hey, people aren't getting it on the quizzes or whatever, and I'm going to send out a special video to this class, and I'm going to say, hey, fall 2024 class, here's some specific things it seems like you guys are struggling with, and I want to help you to master these concepts. I also have high confidence in long-term RSI inclusion in graded assignments with rich feedback. So this was, I'm sorry, I don't have my chat up, but Susan, somebody, Robinson, I think it was, asked about what if I'm using Pearson and I give feedback? Well, if you can give rich feedback in your third-party textbook publisher integrated content, and you can make it specific and rich and for a specific student, then that's great. I don't think that it matters if it's housed in the LMS or if it's housed in like a textbook publisher resource or some other resource, or maybe you're using something like a Flipgrid or something like that. And I don't think that that's necessarily that the tool is necessarily important as much as how you use it. We will talk a little bit more about tools in a minute, but the idea here is that it's rich feedback. It's not just the grade. It's, hey, you did a great job explaining this concept in your paper. Weekly announcements explain the content. And here's another important distinction to make is I'm sending out an announcement. It couldn't be canned. So you can't just, even though you taught the course online for 10 years and every 10 week you say the same thing, that wouldn't count here for the RSI. It'd have to be specific to the course. Extremely responsive was the word that I heard when I was researching this. In other words, hey, in the discussion, great point, Johnny. I really like how you talked about this thing. I'm going to elaborate on that, and I'm going to make it known to the whole class. Very responsive to the fall 2024 class, right? Facilitating asynchronous discussions here counts. It's good because it's giving feedback to the students, and it's also facilitating discussion. So it counts as two things, and is really good. I do have long-term speculative concern about the asynchronous nature of it, though, and the quality of the interactions, which doesn't seem to be a criterion right now, but that's my one hesitancy here, is it seems a little divergent from the things we talked about in the previous slide. I also put here video feedback. So going back to that first point of the graded assignments with the rich feedback, it doesn't have to be written feedback. It could be video feedback. So I know faculty here at Palm Beach Atlantic that send video feedback on the student's paper, and they like to do the sandwich comment. So, hey, great job on this. Let's work on this and let's do this other thing. And they'll do video comments to all their students on important papers in their courses, and the students find that really valuable. And then you can make a plan of a bunch of pieces that fit together. But the important thing here would be just that you go back to the regular part of it, and it would need to feel to the students planned, structured, and I would put in the syllabus even like the weeks that you'll be reaching out, so that it doesn't feel just like an ad hoc email that gets sent every once in a while, and it feels connected to the structure of the course. There's two things that are included technically in RSI right now that I don't feel super confident including long-term, and I would just be careful of. The first one is scheduled office hours. You remember we talked about earlier about the idea of help sessions where the professor is reaching out and saying, hey, everybody, if you're struggling, come to this session and I'm going to help you. And I think that that's what, when they talk about the RSI, I think that's what they're talking about, is that kind of thing. Not just I have office hours, come if you want. I have office hours, come if you want is a divergence from previous guidance, which kind of further makes me question the long-term viability of leaning on office hours as one of your two RSI components that you're going to include in your course. The other thing that I am skeptical about, but technically would count right now, is an asynchronous ask your professor discussion board in your course. So I've seen where people like to put, hey, if you have a question here, and then the idea being that as a student, I can ask a question that all my peers would have access to that information too. I think it's nice in concept, but I have two concerns with it. The first one is that it isn't instructor driven, kind of like the scheduled office hours. Both of those are not instructor driven, they're student driven. And that gives me pause. The second one with the asynchronous Ask Your Professor discussion board is that I think it can be difficult for faculty, even though that you can subscribe to the discussion in a lot of LMSs and that kind of thing, but I think it can be difficult for faculty to execute on the delivery of the design of an Ask Your Professor. So in other words, a student posts something on Monday. If the professor doesn't get back to that student by Friday or the following week because they didn't check the discussion, and maybe there's not a lot of interaction in those usually. So them not interacting in the discussion board may not be like a really crazy thing for them to not do. So that gives me a lot of pause there. And I would be careful on leaning too much on asynchronous Ask Your Professor discussions. So if that's what does count, let's talk about what doesn't count toward RSI. And by all means, you are still more than welcome to do these things in your course. As Josh said earlier, there's nothing that prevents you from doing any of these things. They just don't count toward RSI. So if these things are appropriate in your course, by all means, do the things that are appropriate in your course. But then we're going to need to look at other things for RSI. So the first one is a weekly announcement explaining the administration of the course, right? So we talked about an extremely responsive announcement that talks about the content, which would be RSI. Now we're talking about a non-responsive announcement, or in this case, what I wrote here, an administration. So I just want to remind everybody, your midterms are due on Sunday of the midterm week, right? Well, that doesn't talk about geology, right? Or whatever the topic is that we're talking about. That just talks about when the paper's due. The second one is weekly video pages that explain coming up this week. And the takeaway here is that the RSI should be responsive to the class. So if you're going to have a weekly kind of coming up, it would have to be, you'd have to refilm it every time that you offer the class. Video lectures are not interactive, so those don't count. They're just one way. I think Josh was talking about that earlier, kind of that one-way communication. Graded assignments without feedback, even if there's rubrics. So in other words, hey, there's a rubric. You got a 19 out of 20, next paper, 18 out of 20, next paper, 19 out of 20, next paper. There's no personalized feedback there. So that kind of feedback is different from, hey, great point that you made here on this thing, and try elaborating on this other thing. Auto-graded quizzes and auto-graded publisher content, including AI, wouldn't count toward RSI because it's not in the definition of RSI. They want that authentic feedback from the instructor. And that's what you wouldn't see here. So in that previous example of I'm using textbook publisher content, you know, I'm just giving the number grade, that wouldn't count. It has to be that rich feedback that we talked about before. All right, this is part 2 of 2. Of what does not count toward RSI. And again, Tom is going to send these slides around, so don't feel like you need to screenshot everything. But the first one would be one-off interactions. So just like an ad hoc email that I'm just going to send off occasionally. I like to email my class at some point and just send them all encouraging emails. Well, the idea is that it's planned, it's scheduled, it's regular, and a one-off interaction wouldn't be planned, even if it was an email or a meeting. Now, if you plan it and you build it into the syllabus and the schedule and that kind of thing, that's a different story. I'm talking about, I'm just going to send an email, right? Student-to-student interaction is kind of the next 2 points. And student-to-student doesn't count because the idea, and student-to-student interaction is great, There's another standard for the quality matters rubric. That's a whole different conversation though. So if it's, unfacilitated group work, or in the case of the third bullet point here, if you're just providing an open forum, like a Zoom meeting that's just always going to run and, come join it if you want to, kind of a thing, or something like that, right? That wouldn't count, because the idea is that the students should be interacting with the faculty. Goes back to Josh's point of like, we are the academy, right? We want students interacting with faculty. The third one here is interactions with non-credentialed staff. And the key here is non-credentialed, because that has different contexts at different universities. So I saw in the pre-webinar questions, somebody asked, well, what about TAs? TAs are categorized differently at different universities. And in some universities, they're credentialed. In some universities, they're more like support staff. Support staff being like, imagine, I see this a lot in professional programs, right? Where like a nursing program would have maybe a bunch of coordinators that help coordinate some of the field work and some of the testing that needs to happen and some of those things. But they might not be credentialed to actually teach the content of what it is, ER nursing or whatever. They're not credentialed to teach that. They just help with other things. Those interactions wouldn't count toward RSI, because they're not credentialed to teach, psychiatry, nursing, or whatever the topic is in the course.
Brian, can I jump in on that real quick?
Yeah, Josh.
I just wanted to throw out, I think the phrasing that's in the rule is meets the accreditor's definition of instructor. So it'll vary region to region possibly. So check with your institution if you have specific questions on if an individual qualifies.
It's good. All right, Josh is going to elaborate on the regular and substantive parts and talk about some factors too.
Okay. I'm going to elaborate very quickly. I've got opportunity bolded there because that is key here. That's why some things like virtual office hours can qualify at this time, because you can schedule them, they're predictable, and there's an opportunity even if the student doesn't take advantage of it. So it does meet the letter of the rule. And then promptly and proactively part is in there too. So I would have some statements somewhere saying, we'll respond to email within 48 hours or whatever the policies of the class are. Next one, Brian. Okay, so there are 5 types of substantive interaction allowed, but it's really just 4 because I'm not aware of any accreditors that have defined anything new under Part 5 there. So we've talked about most of these types of instruction there, but it is crucial that you know the rule calls for 2 types, not 2 instances. So in a longer form presentation, we go through some scenarios where we talk about types of interactions and then categorize them in here, because you don't want to have an instructor doing 3 instances of one type of interaction and then they don't actually meet RSI because there's not 2 types. All right, next one. Scheduled and predictable. We've even talked about some of this in the past. Well, Brian was talking commensurate with the length of the course. So these are some of the things that the accreditor has some leeway to work with you on. So we say for a 16-week course, you're going to have 2 types of interactions per week. But in a 4 to 6 week course, we would work with the faculty member to probably, maybe have 2 types of 4 total instances, per week. It's at the course level, so you're not looking at a cohort of students that's going through a program. So we're going to measure this per the program per week or something. It's at the course level. and there's some examples of types of statements that you might want to include to meet schedule and predictable. Right, next one. This is just a quick snapshot of our worksheet. This is a bare bones version, or what's much different that we're using now, but it's something that if you want to download it and modify it to your institution, you're perfectly welcome to. So the faculty are just going through this and checking. Week 1, I'm going to have a live orientation meeting about the content, and we're going to do a group discussion. So check and check. Those are my 2 types for this week, and just plan it out through the semester that way, because planned interactions are more likely to occur than unplanned ones. So next. There is an instruction sheet. It's got a lot of the same information we've covered today. And then I think this will bring us to our last slide. So there are links there. You can download these things. I think you do have to be signed into a Google account because they're in a Google Drive. Contact information is there. And then I rely really heavily on the WebCT Frontiers blog. It's an excellent blog. Some of their authors have been on these negotiated rulemaking committees, and so it's a great place to get information about that. And I think that leaves us a couple of minutes for questions before we let Tom close us out.
Real quick, definitely please do enter more questions if you have them below. I saw as I was scrolling from when I was talking, I noticed there were 2 questions that I just wanted to emphasize. The first one was somebody said, what about accelerated courses? So what do I need to do in accelerated courses? And there's no differentiation built into the rules for accelerated courses. But I wanted to point out Josh's slide here that it should be obviously scheduled and predictable, but commensurate with the length of the course. So, if you have 4-week courses at your university, obviously you're not going to schedule those maybe at the same frequency or at the same volume that you would a 16-week course, right? I think so. I mean, you could disagree, but that's what it says. Is it's commensurate with the length of the course is what we have here. The other thing was about there was kind of further discussion, which I thought was really good, about the librarians and do librarians count? And I would say 2 things. My primary point, though, would be going back to kind of that guardrails conversation, which is that, and I'm not diminishing the role of librarians at all. I think librarians are super phenomenal, helpful, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. But I just wouldn't lean too heavily on that for all of the courses, right? I wouldn't take a lot of liberties with that. So are there courses where the librarians help the students to meet learning objectives? Absolutely. Are there courses where the librarians would count? Absolutely. Is that a strategy that you want to lean on for all of your courses? I would say probably not. So I don't know, Tom, if you had anything to add to that.
There might be an instance for your ENC 1101 class goes for the research orientation at the library or something. I could see, maybe you making the case that that's an instance of direct instruction that for your course, but I wouldn't say that having a librarian acting as a TA necessarily would count unless your institution says, yes, we can make the case that this is okay with our accreditors, this person meets the definition.